Have you ever heard a sound that simply shouldn't be there? A whisper in an empty room? A footstep on the stairs when you're home alone? Tonight, we're journeying to a small, forgotten village, nestled deep in the countryside, where a mystery still echoes through the valley, the mystery of the bells that rang by themselves. Our story centers on the old stone church of St. Giles, a place that has stood for centuries, its spire a silent finger pointing towards the heavens. The church is famous for its bell tower, home to 3 heavy bronze bells, each with its own name: Faith, Hope, and Charity. For generations, their chimes mark the hours, called the faithful to prayer, and celebrated weddings. But their most important job was to toll for the departed, a final, solemn farewell. Ringing these bells was no small feat. It required a team of strong bell ringers, pulling on thick, coarse ropes that ran down the height of the tower. The sound was immense, a deep, resonant peal that could be heard for miles around. One bitter winter, a wave of sickness swept through the village. It was a grim, relentless time. The doctor was overwhelmed, and nearly every family lost someone they loved. The air grew heavy with sorrow, and the constant, mournful tolling of faith, hope, and charity became the soundtrack to their grief. The bell ringers, exhausted and heartsick, pulled the ropes day after day, their own hands raw, their own families suffering. Eventually, the sickness claimed the head bell ringer, a kind, elderly man named Thomas, and his 2 apprentices soon after. With no one left to ring them, the bells of St. Giles fell silent. The silence was, in its own way, more deafening than the tolling. It felt unnatural, as if the village had lost its very heartbeat. The dead were being laid to rest without the traditional honors, a quiet procession to the churchyard that felt incomplete, and this weighed heavily on the survivors. They prayed in their homes and in the pews of the cold church, not just for the souls of their departed, but for a sign, any sign, that they were not forgotten, that their final journey was acknowledged. Then, one moonless night, it happened. As the clock in the village square was about to strike midnight, a sound rolled across the frosted fields. Bong. A single, clear, powerful chime from the church tower. The villagers who were still awake froze, listening. Had they imagined it? Bong. It came again, deeper this time, the unmistakable voice of hope, then a third, the highest and sweetest of the 3. Bong. Charity. 3 distinct rings, echoing in the frozen air, then silence. The next morning, the village was buzzing. Everyone had heard it. The village elder, a man whose face was a roadmap of long years and local lore, gathered the anxious folk in the square. He listened to their stories, nodding his gray head. A few brave men had rushed to the church right after the ringing. They found the tower door locked, just as it had been for weeks. Inside, dust lay thick and undisturbed on the floor. The great ropes hung perfectly still, their ends coiled neatly as they had been left. There was no one there. No footprints in the snow around the church, no sign of any human presence. It was impossible. The bells were immensely heavy. The wind couldn't move them, and birds couldn't budge them. It required coordinated, powerful force. Yet they had rung. The elder, his voice raspy but firm, offered an explanation that sent a shiver through the crowd. It wasn't a ghost story to frighten children, but something else, something deeper. He said it was an answer. For weeks, he explained, we have prayed for our dead. We have mourned that we could not give them their final farewell. Last night, they answered us. He believed that the spirits of the departed, hearing the sorrow of the living, had returned to ring the bells for themselves. The first chime was for the souls who had passed. The second was to comfort the families left behind. And the third was a promise of reunion, a peal of hope for the future. It wasn't a haunting, it was a final, loving goodbye. The story spread, passed down from one generation to the next. The bells of St. Giles never rang on their own again. New bell ringers eventually took up the ropes, and life in the village slowly returned to normal. But the memory of that one impossible midnight never faded. It became a cornerstone of their history, a piece of folklore that brought comfort rather than fear. It taught them that even in the deepest silence of grief, love can find a way to make itself heard, to bridge the gap between this world and the next, and to answer a prayer with the beautiful, impossible sound of a bell ringing in an empty tower. What do you think? Was it a miracle? A collective auditory hallucination born of grief? Or was it, as the elders said, the dead answering the prayers of the living? The beauty of a story like this is that it doesn't need a definitive answer. It lives in the mystery, in the space between what we know and what we believe. It reminds us that there are some things in this world that science can't quite explain, and maybe, just maybe, shouldn't. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey into the mysterious and the magical. If you enjoyed this story, please hit that like button and consider subscribing for more tales from the crossroads of history and folklore. I'd love to hear your own family stories or local legends in the comments below. Until next time, stay curious.